DC's got some great museums, but none where you can live out your wildest rock star dreams. Cleveland's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is where legends come alive. You can even jam out with their house band in their interactive musical experience, The Garage. And don't miss their incredible new SNL exhibit featuring Will Ferrell's famous cowbell and the complete archive of every SNL musical performance ever aired. Check out the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to learn more about the music that connects us all. Find more info at rockhall.com/exhibitions/SNL-50-years-music.
Today on CityCast DC, it's our Friday News Roundup, and we're talking about the return, for now maybe, of an accused bribe taker to the DC Council. We're also talking about the antisemitism investigation that looks like the latest Trump versus Washington contretemps. And it's the Citi Open tennis tournament this weekend. We're going to talk about how to get the most of it. Plus, in a members-only fourth segment, the Congressman accused of not paying his rent. I'm here with NBC4's Mark Segraves and my CityCast colleague Annie Reese. Today is Friday, June 18th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Annie.
Hey.
So, Mark, you cover city politics for Channel 4. Were you down there in Ward 8 on Tuesday night at the end of the special election?
I did not go down for election night. I was there the day before talking to people. But, obviously it was a big night for Trayon White.
So to back up, Trayon White, for the uninitiated, was a DC council member. He was indicted for allegedly taking bribes. The indictment included very helpful photos of him taking a lot of money in a car. He says he's not guilty. He says they're out to get him. He was booted from the DC Council by his colleagues last year, which triggered a special election in which he ran and won. He won with like 30% of the vote against a bunch of different candidates and a very small number of total voters. But he is now going back to the council, which raises a whole bunch of questions, both about like whether Congress uses this as an example of how Washington can't govern itself, whether his former and now current colleague kick him off, and why the hell the city establishment can't get its act together to like get a single candidate to not split the vote. Mark, do you think they're going to kick him off again?
I got to tell you, it seems less likely this time around than the last time. You'll recall the last time it was unanimous vote. They went through the whole deal of doing their own, ad hoc committee and independent investigation. And then they held a hearing and then they held a vote. And that again was unanimous. This time, given the conversations that we have seen occurring in the recent council breakfast meeting where Chairman Mendelson floated the idea of legislation that would have allowed the council to more easily expel Trayon White the second time around, met a lot of resistance, mostly from Zachary Parker, the Ward 5 council member, really spoke out very forcefully against this and really making race the central issue of what his concern is, pointing to former councilmember Jack Evans and President Trump, who has been convicted himself. And so you had that. You had Matt Fruman from Ward 3 also expressing concerns, not along the same lines as Fruman, but just wrestling with the decision to a second time overturn the will of the voters. And then on election night, you saw Ward 7 council member Wendell Felder at his party, at Trayon White's victory party, shaking hands, congratulating him. And so it definitely does not seem like they have the unanimous votes to do it. Chairman Mendelson withdrew that legislation that he was proposing that would have made it easier because of the resistance that he was getting from his colleagues. He has not said, Chairman Mendelson has not said what he plans to do. He did say in that breakfast meeting that he would not call this for a vote unless there were 5 co-sponsors. So, that's where we are right now. It is unknown what they'll do. I can say it was probably easier the first time to make the argument of overturning the will of the voters because maybe they weren't as informed about the indictment then. But now there certainly isn't that argument. It's hard to imagine that anybody voted in that election who didn't have some knowledge of the charges pending against Councilmember White. And 30% decided that they wanted to reelect him anyway. And so as Councilmember White said on election night, the people have spoken.
There's so many weird things about this, but one of them is it takes place against this backdrop of Washington's home rule being uniquely threatened, and members of Congress and the White House who have pretty clearly demonstrated they're going to use sort of any weapon they can. And you guys have just returned to office somebody who is indicted in an indictment that includes pictures, who has previously, said that he thinks the Rothschilds control the weather. This is somebody who's pretty easy to paint as a nitwit who should not be anywhere near the levers of power. And ordinarily you'd say, well, that's for us to decide because it's democracy. But the consequence of this restoration could be that all of us lose our self-government. I mean, that's sort of one of the arguments that's kind of in the background here, it seems to me.
It is part of the fabric of every decision the council and the mayor make these days. Is you have a president who routinely threatens to take control of the district, even when he's saying nice things about the mayor and the district. And you have a Congress who also is not reluctant to weigh in and make changes to D.C. law or, when they see fit. So far, we have not heard from the president or Congress about this election and what they might do. I don't know if it's gotten on their radar yet or if they're just kind of waiting to see if the council takes action. We're just going to have to wait and see about that. But it is certainly a problem or a factor that hasn't had to been a factor for decades, but now is with every decision this government makes, the scrutiny that it could bring from the federal government and the possibility that the feds could step in one way or another. So that's definitely at play here. And that may be the most motivating factor that might bring around the council members to take this vote because of the fear of just what you described, that yes, the argument would be, yes, we're overturning the will of the voters, 2,700 voters, but the bigger picture is, the entire city could lose our autonomy if the council doesn't take some kind of action. So we'll just have to wait and see. And the mayor has said this in the past, that she's just trying to get through these 4 years.
But listen, man, if that is true, why did she and the rest of the sort of establishment act in such a pusillanimous way during this campaign? She could have endorsed someone. She and people with money and people with power and influence could have said, listen, there's 3 people also running for that seat. Let's convince 2 of them to leave the race. Let's throw our arms around the last one. Let's do all this stuff, which comes with some risk because people might be mad at you and so on. But this is what you do if something is important. And they didn't do it. They just kind of wimped out. Did you have any insight into what they were thinking?
I don't know why. The mayor has said in the past she's reluctant to weigh in on elections when she's not on the ballot, although some people would dispute that. I think Alyssa Silverman would dispute that. Look back to Ward 3, speaking of Alyssa Silverman. Look back to Ward 3 and that race that gave us Matt Fruman when we had a crowded field and it looked to many people like Eric Goulet was going to win that race. And several people dropped out, leaving it a 2-person race between Matt Fruman and Eric Goulet. And Matt Fruman won with that. And so that's an example of exactly what you're talking about the establishment or the party or whoever it was that was behind that, getting together and making the collective decision that it's more important that this person doesn't win than all these other people run. And we need to get together on the same page about that. But part of that calculation may have been that the 3 candidates we're looking at the long game, that it didn't really matter who won this special election because this is going to likely be in the short term, because even if he's allowed to stay on the council, he'll go to trial in January. And the evidence as we've seen it is pretty compelling evidence. And so if he were to be convicted in January of next year, then we set up another special election without Trayon White in the mix. And those three candidates who you saw would probably run again. And that would be the real election in this instance.
But as you just said, there is no long game. I mean, that every day she wakes up and is still mayor, it's a good day. That's not a long game.
No, not for her. And you'd have to ask the mayor why she didn't step in affirmatively like that, why the Ward 8 Democrats didn't step in like that, or the DC party as a whole. And I don't know if any of them had those conversations with one another. But this is what happens. I think we all kind of suspected that this would happen. If you have an incumbent running against a crowded field, the crowded field chews up the opposition vote, and the incumbent, when winner takes all, look, the big conversation since election night has been ranked choice voting, right? You saw Christina Henderson's tweet just minutes after the results came in. So the system that we currently have under this election, this is the result. So for a lot of people, this is the example of why ranked choice voting should be allowed. And certainly we have had many instances in the history of DC government with council members being elected. Phil Mendelson, Alyssa Silverman come to mind, with a very small percentage. I think Phil Mendelson was first elected with 17%. Alyssa Silverman may have gotten in with 11%. I could have those numbers wrong, but they're ballpark. And so when you have the vast majority of people voting against the person who won, it leaves open this question: is there a better system?
Yeah. I mean, also the historical parallels with Marion Barry were so widespread and evident, and just kind of an interesting kind of contextual footnote here, I think, for all of us watching. Mark, what about the T-shirts? Can you tell me about that? It sounds like Trayon White said he spent almost nothing on campaign finance, but there were literally T-shirts for his election. It's who paid? Were there sort of interesting details with this micro skeletal campaign that was run?
Yeah, you saw message boards driving around. There's certainly questions as to who would have paid, who did pay. But I got to say, these are the kind of questions that get raised, and sometimes they're, Bega or other, Office of Campaign Finance looks at stuff. I don't see any of that coming back to having any real ramifications on anybody. I don't
Except
think.
Except that in this case, this is not just some person who you didn't want to winning. This is a person who has been kicked off and who they're going to weigh kicking off again. And if he filed forms saying he spent zero money, and then there's evidence of money being spent, and he's not saying who spent the money or where the money came from, that seems like potentially another violation that is sort of germane to this in a way that it's not for some random council member.
No, you're right. You're not wrong about that. We've never really seen the appetite in DC for, strong enforcement, or where even when there is enforcement and fines are paid, that there's really that it really impacts people's decision. It's really kind of a inside baseball thing that some of us would be following, but the vast majority of the public, I don't think, is really that concerned with that.
Yeah. No, I just think it might be relevant because for this time and this time only, his future does not depend on the vast majority of the public, but it does depend on his 12 would-be colleagues who have the power to boot him and, in theory, are the kind of people who do or ought to follow that kind of letter of the law stuff about campaign finance forms that the rest of us find too boring.
If you look at the original language that allows the council to expel a member, there's a really high threshold of what somebody, how egregious a violation or a crime had to be. With Jack Evans, as you'll recall, those are the kinds of things that he was, I don't want to say found guilty because, he was never charged with any crimes, but certainly that's the universe of infractions that Jack Evans was accused of and committed. What we see with Councilmember White and actually being indicted for a crime. So the campaign finance stuff is not something typically that under the law would rise to the level of grounds for expulsion.
Well, obviously so much more to come on this in the next few months. It's a story that is just going to keep getting richer and richer, I think.
Got CityCast set to auto-download? Now you're cooking with gas. Wait, cooking with gas is so last century. Not only is an all-electric home cleaner and healthier, but it can save energy and money too. Thanks to the DC SEU, or the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, it's easier and more affordable than ever to electrify. As in, any district resident can get up to $15,000 off upgrades. Income qualified folks, they can upgrade at no cost. Seriously. And the DC SEU has rebates for the good stuff. Heat pumps that warm and cool efficiently. Induction stoves that boil water faster than Donna Summer can say, well, hot stuff. Their team can help you update your electric panel, delivering the upgrades that make adding new appliances possible. But hey, the funding won't last. Visit dcseu.com/electric and bust a move on energy-efficient home electrification today.
Join the Library of Congress on July 24th for Ask the Ethicist, a live session with Kwame Anthony Appiah, 2024 recipient of the Kluge Prize and resident New York Times ethics columnist, who helps readers sort through life's sticky situations and moral dilemmas, from crypto and AI to lawn chemicals, pet names, using sick leave to slack off, and yes, politics. The ethicist seems to have heard it all. In this special interactive event, explore real-world moral dilemmas and cast your vote on what you would do. Then, hear how one of today's most influential public philosophers thinks through the same questions. Thoughtful and engaging, the library invites you to reflect on everyday ethical questions in a way that's personal, relevant, and fun. That's Ask the Ethicist on July 24th at the Library of Congress. Get free tickets at loc.gov/live.
So speaking of stuff that could get in the way of Washington maintaining its ability to democratically rule itself, the Department of Justice official in charge of investigating anti-Semitism publicly wrote a letter to Mayor Bowser this week that said, basically, you all in the DC government are doing a terrible job on this. It says that Jewish organizations in the city have to pay, quote unquote, Jewish taxes, by which it meant, I gather, having to shell out of your own pocket to lay on security against a violent threat that is out there. This why DC of all places, this is sort of in the wake of the shooting at the Jewish Museum. But it sure looked to me, I mean, forgive me for being cynical, but I don't detect a whole lot of good faith here. It sure looked to me like an excuse to bludgeon the city, which is a convenient political target, by a Department of Justice official who also tweets about, like, Trump is the greatest president of my lifetime. Leo Terrell is his name. He asked the mayor for a meeting. She responded with some sort of, like, through channels or, these are the appropriate people in the government to meet. It was not a, like, oh my God, come to my office immediately. And this was described as being a lukewarm response to this crisis. The whole thing seems like really ugly and the kind of thing that's going to, maybe it's being used as an excuse to do something to home rule. Maybe it's just an excuse to hassle a Democratic-run city. There's also a legit, issue of, like, why is it that synagogues have to pay for security and churches don't? I mean, not because the city will provide them security, but because they don't feel immediate, violent, anti-Semitic threat. This has been the case for a long time. It's not just a last couple of years thing. But, if this is part of the bill of complaints that leads to the end of local democracy for what is still a majority minority city, that's a really ugly causality too. I mean, the whole thing strikes me as just like so many shades of ugly. And I'm wondering, Mark, you've covered this stuff a long time, but just politically, what's kind of the best way for the city to respond to that moment?
The question that you posed, why are they targeting D.C.? We saw the hearings recently with the universities. Georgetown University here in the district was one of the universities that was questioned about this same realm of defending against anti-Semitism. The mayor did offer up, other than not offering herself, she did offer up the highest level people in her administration, the deputy mayor, the city administrator, the head of HSEMA, to talk to this group about the problems that they are concerned with. Not everybody gets to meet with the mayor. She's obviously very busy. But here's the comparison that I would draw just with regard to her reaction and kind of her and I wouldn't call it a snub because, again, she offered up some very high level people to take this meeting. It wasn't like she ignored the request. But you'll recall, many of us have kind of fallen off our radar, but there is another committee that the president has formed for oversight of Washington, D.C., run by federal agencies that the mayor also hasn't participated in. And in that one, I don't believe she sent anybody. Remember that first meeting? We thought the chief of police announced she was going to go to this meeting. And then the mayor, pulled that back and said, no, nobody's going to this meeting. And so I think this is just, again, how the mayor and the administration is kind of tiptoeing through this minefield when these things pop up, not wanting to raise the ire of the president, but also trying to tamp down the legitimacy of what they're complaining about. And it's again, everything, is a tightrope that they're walking these days. So I think she's trying to strike that balance, and also I don't think she wants to lend credibility to that, the narrative that either DC isn't doing enough or that there's this crisis in DC because of this, tragic incident that we had where people were killed in front of the Jewish Museum. And I honestly don't know if that meeting ever actually took place. And so we'll have to see if there's any true follow-up to that. But it is just another, again, they keep just chipping away, like you say, they just keep chipping away at DC on all these little issues. And the mayor and the council and the attorney general, and, they just want to try to keep their finger in the dike and keep it from bursting. And this is just another, crack in that dam.
Right. Well, it does feel like, I wonder, like, when, if ever, we get to a place where home rule goes away, if there's a real case that's presented of, like, check out these, 3 to 5 to whatever instances. Like sometimes when I think all of our spidey sense goes up with something like this, because it feels like, as you say, Mike and Mark, like an example that could be used, or, maybe that's sort of like overreading it anyway. It's not like a case is being assembled or something.
We're in a moment of like massive national and I guess local bad faith, right? I wrote last week about the use of the National Capital Planning Commission, this incredibly wonky little board that approves, federal building plans and stuff. Trump suddenly got rid of the Biden appointees, packed for the presidential appointees with like actually really important White House people, not just like minor wonks, in order to use this commission. And I went to the meeting because it was like, why are there these important people here? Isn't this a terrible use of their time? And then the minute they got the mic, they started ranting about Jerome Powell and the Fed and how the Fed had violated the sanctity of its plans as endorsed by the National Capital Planning Commission, and there needed to be an investigation and so on. And it's quite clear what they're doing is trying to use this minor architecture board to assemble a case for firing the head of the central bank that's supposed to be independent. So, there's a kind of like, you got to read between the lines vibe of like, nothing is what it seems to be. So I don't think the people involved are particularly concerned about the sanctity of the National Capital Planning Act and whether it was violated. But this is their sort of use of power. And so the same thing, you've got to look at when there's a demand on the mayor of Washington about her alleged countenancing of an anti-Semitism crisis. Perhaps it is not what it says it is. Perhaps the demand is actually about something else. And we're not quite sure what the something else is, but this is sort of the moment we're in where, as you said, Annie, like our spidey senses are constantly going up because anything could be used as part of a bill of complaints in order to achieve some other and seemingly unrelated goal.
I will say that the mayor has been hanging her hat on the control board, whether, that gets reignited. Whenever I've asked her about that possibility and she dismisses it, she points to the fact that in the law, the control board is triggered by finances, right? It's really a financial backstop.
Can you explain for people who don't know what the control board is?
So the control board came in, years ago when districts' finances were just deplorable and just failing. And we were in danger of going bankrupt. And so a control board was appointed that really took control of the city, except for the Department of Parks and Rec. Everything else was run by this presidentially appointed control board. And I think they realized that it was a mistake because nobody wants to run a city, right? The federal government doesn't want to run a city and the trash pickup and crime and all this other stuff. And so it lasted for several years. Then we came out the other side, and it was just a real dark time in DC's history because we really did lose our home rule and our self-determination in many, many ways. And the control board is still there technically. It's just not activated. So it's kind of lurking back there and can be triggered by the president. Again, the trigger is the finances. If they fail to meet certain criteria with their budget, balancing a budget, reserve funds on hand and whatnot. That said, so that's the mayor's argument, is that, well, our finances are strong, right? Nobody can point to our finances and say they're not strong, particularly as we stack up, even though our bond rating has been downgraded recently, but so has so many other jurisdictions' bond ratings, including the countries around the United States. So that said, the problem with the mayor's argument that it's strictly a financial trigger is that we have a president and a Republican Congress who don't seem to care about the rules and will go in and do what they want to do regardless. And I know when I had this conversation with the mayor several months ago, she said, well, Mark, we're a country of laws and courts, and the courts never allow it. And I kind of just laughed, thinking, like, are you watching the courts? That he is doing whatever he wants to do, whether the courts side with him or not. And so it's certainly a threat. And yes, they could make a case, whether it be, crime or homelessness or anti-Semitism or, an indicted member on the DC council. And if they start throwing all of these things together, they could certainly make a case that I think the casual American sitting in, Midwest would look at it and say, oh, yeah, somebody needs to step in. And so, that's certainly the threat every day, whether we get to a point where the president really tries to make that case. And I think that's why you've seen him tinkering around the edges and targeting specific things that the president wants done, stopping short of actually taking control of the city, and the mayor acquiescing and trying to appease the president every time the White House points to something that they want taken care of. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if the mayor does something in the affirmative around anti-Semitism and protection for Jewish institutions, just to kind of, again, put the finger in the dike and keep them at arm's length.
Marketers, you know that feeling when your content just works? When you crush a viral trend before 10 a.m.? When one tiny tweak to a landing page sends click-through rates through the roof? That's Contentful. Dynamic content made blissfully simple. Contentful helps you create and launch personalized experiences instantly across any digital channel. No stress, no limits, only possibilities. Come get the feels at Contentful.com.
Get lost in the acoustic brilliance of 3D audio that surrounds you. Feel the embrace of the massage seats that adapt to your every move. Experience the warmth of a vehicle that welcomes you as you approach. We could tell you what makes a Lincoln SUV so extraordinary, but don't take our word for it. Take it on a test drive at the Lincoln Summer Invitation, with exclusive offers on now, only at your local Lincoln retailer.
All right, well, I've got something that's a slightly different tack. If we can change course to tennis. The Citi Open's happening this weekend. Are either of you tennis fans?
I'm going to plead guilty to not being a tennis fan, but I got to say, being a lifelong resident here, the Citi Open, the tennis tournaments up in Rock Creek have been a great addition to Washington, D.C., to the fabric of that part of town, to the sports community.
I think y'all are going to have to convince me here because I'm not a tennis fan either, but I've always thought, since this started, and it was, like you said, Mark, not like that, it was not the all-star thing. Who was the idiot who thought it would be great to have people sit outdoors and watch tennis in Washington, D.C. in July?
That might be Arthur Ashe. Famed
okay. Point withdrawn. But seriously, the timing, can we just agree maybe the timing is suboptimal?
The timing is suboptimal, but it's the start that kicks off the hard court season in DC. So for tennis fans, we're just done with Wimbledon. US Open is going to be Labor Day in New York. We're kicking off the hard court season. This is a tennis tournament that's running for the next week plus. And one thing I think is pretty cool about it is it's the only tennis tournament in the world that's actually played at a public park, played at Rock Creek Park Tennis Center. It's in its 55th year. And there's a ton of incredible talent coming. Just like Mark was saying, a lot of people who are recently at Wimbledon. We've got Ben Shelton, who's dating Washington Spirit star Trinity Rodman, Francis Tiafoe, who is a DC local, Naomi Osaka, Nick Kyrgios, Wimbledon runner-up Amanda Anisimova, and Venus Williams. So anyway, I'm obviously very into tennis, but one thing I love about tennis is that even if you're not that into it, find someone who kind of is, and you can get a narrative. They'll tell you just enough to make whatever match you're watching really interesting. There's a lot of different ticket packages you can get. A single game is $35. I've got a pass for Saturday that was $50, and we're just going to kind of walk around in the heat, as Mike said. So I'll be trying to find shade where I can. But it's a really, it's a really neat thing that we have in DC, and I would encourage people to check it out. Another kind of interesting development here is that, Mayor Bowser is working with the Department of Interior to try to revamp Rock Creek Park Tennis Center. This is a thing that is kind of a goal of Mark Ein, who owns the Citi Open. And so I think that, we may be seeing a lot more developments to Rock Creek Park Tennis Center and to Carter Barron, which, as you have discussed, Mike, is kind of in this weird limbo because they're run by NPS, the National Park Service. But I think that, that level of investment could be really neat for tennis.
All right, well, I guess that's all we have to say about that. Today, paid subscribers get a bonus 4th roundup chat. We're going to talk about a congressman who is not paying his rent. If you want to be sure you always get the full episode, become a member, please. Head to membership.citycast.fm and sign up. It's only $10 a month, and members get ad-free listening, exclusive member events, and an extra events newsletter every week. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm. And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. Our production team this week was Priyanka Tilbe, Annie Reese, Julia Karen, Ash Durbin, and Catherine Gorman. Newsletter editor Kayla Cote-Stemmerman wrote our fabulous newsletter Hey DC this week. And our hosts are Bridget Todd and me, Michael Schaefer from Politico. Music is by Alex Roldan. With additional music from S2 Cool, Philip Ayers, and Duff Kelly from Triple Scoop Music via Getty Images. If you enjoyed the show, why not take to the stage at Carter Barron, which is empty right now, and shout it at the top of your lungs to anyone who will hear. We'll be back Monday morning with more news from around the city. Bye.